When it comes to voting in game theory, the majority isn't always the majority. This is the spoiler problem in one picture. 6 voters split between 2 similar candidates while 4 voters choose the winner. For most of us, majority rule feels like the essence of democracy. One person, one vote. It's simple, fair, and final. Except, elections don't always reveal the will of the majority. Sometimes they distort it. Sometimes a third-party candidate splits one side. Sometimes a primary rewards the most intense faction and leaves out the moderates. Sometimes a map is drawn so carefully that the voters are chosen before they ever vote. The Declaration of Independence says that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. But that simple idea hides a difficult problem. How do we design voting methods that measure the will of the people? And it gets complicated fast. Economist Kenneth Impossibility Theorem proved one of the central precepts of social choice theory. Once there are 3 or more choices, no voting system can perfectly convert individual preferences into a consistent collective design while satisfying every fairness condition we might want. One of the most common failures is the spoiler candidate, someone who loses the election but changes the winner by splitting the vote. In Gaming the Vote, William Poundstone argues that spoiler candidates have repeatedly shaped American presidential elections. He writes, 5 presidential elections were probably decided by spoilers: 1844, 1848, 1884, 1912, and 2000. At least 2 others, 1892 and 1992, are questionable cases. In still another race, 1860, 4-way vote splitting in the Electoral College created such ambiguity that it was a factor in precipitating the Civil War. That is not a small claim. Poundstone is saying that the spoiler effect is not a footnote in American history. It is woven through it. The pattern appears again and again. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose campaign split the Republican vote, helping Woodrow Wilson win the presidency. In 1992, Ross Perot won nearly 19% of the popular vote and became a part of the long argument whether George H.W. Bush was damaged by a spoiler. Then came 2000. George W. Bush carried Florida, and with it the presidency, by just 537 votes. Ralph Nader received 97,488 votes. And the same fear returned in 2012. Green Party candidate Jill Stein received barely over 1% of the national vote. But soon after the election, Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report wrote, "Jill Stein is now officially the Ralph Nader of 2016. When third-party vote totals exceed the margin of victory, voters are forced into a strategic dilemma. Vote sincerely and risk helping the candidate they like least, or vote strategically and abandon the candidate they prefer. That is not a healthy democratic incentive. The most consequential spoiler election may have been 1860. Lincoln won with just under 40% of the popular vote, but the Democratic Party split in 2. Stephen Douglas won by 29%, while John Breckinridge won about 18%. Together, the 2 Democrats won more votes than Lincoln nationally. But because the opposition was fractured, Lincoln won the Electoral College decisively. Now, this split did not cause the Civil War by itself, but it helped produce an election result that the slave-holding South refused to accept. Eric Larson's book, The Demon of Unrest, chronicles the 5 chaotic months between Lincoln's election in November 1860 and the Confederate shelling of Fort Sumter in April 1861. Larson, whose books often show history's threads weaving like a braid, captures these months as a democracy coming apart in slow motion. The 1860 election was not merely a vote count. It was a stress test of whether a democracy could survive when one side decided that losing meant that the system itself was illegitimate. That stress test was returned in 2020 when Donald Trump refused to accept his defeat and tried to overturn the result. On January 6, 2021, as Congress met to certify the Electoral College vote, a mob attacked the Capitol. The point is not that 1860 and 2020 are identical. They're not. The point is that democracy depends not only on counting votes, but on losers accepting legitimate outcomes. But legitimacy depends on something else too. The system has to turn voters' preferences into a result that makes democratic sense. And that is harder than it sounds, because voting theory reveals an even stranger problem. Sometimes the danger is not that the majority is overruled. Sometimes the danger is that the majority contradicts itself. In the 18th century, the Marquis de Condorcet showed that majority rule can produce a paradox. Imagine three candidates, A, B, and C. Now, compare them head to head. A majority prefers A to B. A majority prefers B to C. But a majority also prefers C to A. The majority has spoken 3 times and contradicted itself. This is the Condorcet Paradox, and it shows that the majority rule is not as simple as it sounds. Charles Dodson, better known by his pen name Lewis Carroll, became fascinated by the strange contradictions revealed by Condorcet's paradox. Condorcet's methods try to solve this by finding a candidate who would beat every other candidate in a head-to-head race. When such a candidate exists, the candidate is the Condorcet winner. But sometimes no such candidate exists. The preferences form a circle. Dodson went further. His own voting method searched first for that majority preferred winner, and if no such winner existed, it tried to find the candidate who would become one of the fewest possible changes to the ranked ballots. His pamphlet, A Method of Taking Votes on More Than 2 Issues, was his attempt to come to grips with the Condorcet Paradox. In Through the Looking Glass, this is my grandmother's version from 1919, the White Queen says, "Why, sometimes I believed in as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." And voting, it turns out, can produce its own impossible things. So now we know the danger. A third-party candidate does not need to win. They do not even need to come close to winning. They only need to divide the voters closest to them. That is the spoiler effect. And once voters understand that danger, they face a terrible choice. Vote sincerely or vote strategically. A sincere voter chooses the candidate they actually want to win. A strategic voter asks a different question. If you support a third-party candidate, you may help elect the person you oppose most. So voters begin to think like campaign consultants. They do not simply express their preferences, they game the system. That is why spoiler elections are not just mathematical curiosities, they change behavior. They make voters cynical. The majority may exist in the electorate, but it can be scattered across too many candidates to express itself cleanly. The primary system rewards candidates for speaking first to the most partisan voters. This creates a primary paradox. Strong partisan support can help a candidate win control of the party, while making that candidate or the party itself less competitive with the wider electorate. Brookings captured the problem in the title of a recent article, MAGA Republicans Won the Party but May Lose the Future. The article describes the paradox at the center of President Trump's political position. A clear majority of his party wants him in charge, but the tighter his grip becomes, the further he may drift from the rest of the country. In one Economist YouGov survey, only 18% of MAGA Republicans said that the economy was getting worse, compared with 65% of non-MAGA Republicans, which is nearly identical to independent voters. A hardened base can dominate a primary, but that base is not the same thing as a governing majority. And then there is the deepest distortion of all, the map itself. A voting system can distort the count. A primary can distort the electorate. Gerrymandering flips the relationship. Politicians choose voters. And that is exactly the game theory trap. Majority rule is not enough if the majority has been split, filtered, discouraged, packed, cracked, or strategically manipulated before the votes are even counted. There is another form of political power that doesn't appear on the ballot at all: money. Money helps decide who gets heard and who gets attacked, and which messages follow voters from television to YouTube to their phones. On the title page of Dark Money, Jane Mayer quotes Louis Brandeis: "We must make our choice. We may have a democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." Okay, the system is broken, so what do we do about it? First, we should admit there is no perfect answer. It does not mean all voting systems are equally flawed. It means that designing a good and fair election system is much harder than we pretend. There is no perfect voting system, but there are better and worse systems. Voting has to start with participation. A democracy cannot represent people if the people don't show up. That does not mean forcing citizens to support a candidate, but it may mean treating participation as a civic duty. Some democracies penalize eligible voters for failing to participate, notably Australia. As the BBC reports,
now, anyone over the age of 18 has to vote, which means Australia boasts a turnout of over 90%. If you don't vote, you get a $20 fine.
Showing up matters. Second, we should be honest about closed primaries. Fareed Zakaria said of the primary system that
primaries ensure that candidates chosen are selected by a sliver of the party, around 20% of voters. And this selection is not at all representative. These are the most intense, agitated activists.
But even open primary systems can be gamed. In 1975, Louisiana Governor Edwin Edwards pushed through the state's jungle primary. Critics believed it would fragment the Democratic vote and eventually help Edwards return to power. That is essentially what happened. Republican Governor Dave Treen won in '79, and Edwards returned to defeat him 4 years later. As the PBS NewsHour reported, Governor Edwards faced two tough Democratic primary rounds in the 1971 election before his general election run against a Republican opponent who hadn't had the same primary challenges. Third, I propose that we should reduce punishment for sincere voting. This is where ranked voting matters. Instead of choosing one candidate, voters rank candidates in order of preference: first choice, second choice, third choice. Ranked voting does not eliminate strategy. No system does, but it can reduce the punishment for sincerity. Fourth, we need fair maps so politicians can't pre-select their voters. And fifth, severe bans on dark money. And because liberal democracy depends at its core on compromise, because politics is the art of living with people who don't agree and don't claim the election was rigged when they lose. In Sapiens, a comprehensive history of humankind from its inception, Yuval Noah Harari argues that Homo sapiens survived and dominated not because they were individually stronger than other human species, but because they could cooperate flexibly in large numbers. And that's the deeper evolutionary lesson. Fighting can win a moment, coordination can build a civilization, and democracy is one of humanity's great coordination machines. It allows millions of people who disagree, often bitterly, to accept a shared process. But that only works if the system preserves trust. Compromise is not weakness. Compromise is how politics preserves the future. To conclude, the rules matter, and your vote matters. And once you see the rules, you begin to see the game. For another example of how game theory shapes political behavior, watch this video next, because it's deeper than you think.